You've spent all this time milling your own wheat, kneading that bread, making that dough, waiting for it to rise and to bake, waiting for it to cool down before you slice it open, only to find out that either your bread has fallen or it's too dense, you have holes in the middle of your bread, all of these problems. What do you do? Hey everyone, welcome back to Grains and Grit. My name is Felicia. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about the 4 main issues that I see people have when it comes to milling their own wheat and making their own bread. I get questions like these all the time, so here's just one video with some of the common problems that people have so I can share them with you and hopefully help you make really great loaves as well. Before we continue on, question of the day: what has been your biggest problem when it comes to bread baking? Is your bread falling? Is it not rising? Is it too dense? What is your biggest problem? And if it wasn't one that I answered here, I'll try to answer you below. So comment below with the answer to the question of the day. As always, be sure to subscribe below if you have not already. Click that bell icon so you can be notified of new videos. I post videos every single week unlocking the secrets to biblical healthy whole grains, giving you recipes, tips, tricks, reason why you should be using whole grains, and more. So if that sounds something that you would really love and enjoy, be sure to hit that subscribe button below, and be sure to hit the like button below if you love fresh homemade bread. Now, if you don't know, I do have a video posted. It was actually my very first video I've ever posted showing my recipe and technique for large 2-pound loaves using 100% freshly milled wheat. If you have not seen that, definitely look up here. I will link that up for you. And we're going to be discussing the problems that people have when making bread today, and I'm really going to be referring back to that recipe a lot. So when I talk about problems with your bread, I'm talking about a bread that is generally using commercial yeast, not necessarily sourdough, although this definitely can pertain to sourdough as well. Just any sort of bread that you are wanting to rise well, to not be dense, and to look beautiful. Okay, so let's dive into the 4 main issues people have when making bread. The first issue I see, and I had this one myself for a bit until I figured it out, was holes in the bread. As you can see right here, not fun. It looks great on the outside, but then you slice it open and there are these holes, not the ones that you want. Generally, your artisan breads like your sourdough, you want those nice smaller holes, but not gigantic ones like this one in the picture. I was able to resolve this issue by discovering the best way to actually fold my bread. Again, if you refer back to my 2-pound yeast loaf bread video, I show you a technique that I actually learned from Bake with Jack. I will list his channel below. And whenever I started folding my bread this way, it really helped with making sure there were no holes in the bread whatsoever, and the bread came out a beautiful shape. Just to recap what I say in that video, you want to roll out your dough into a rectangle, and then you fold it kind of in thirds. So the top third over, the bottom third over that, and then you just start to roll it, pushing back gently. Smooth out all the sides, make a good oval type shape with your bread that's kind of at a dome. Put it in your loaf pan, wait for it to rise, and then bake. Again, be sure to check out that video to actually see how I do it. And in doing it that way, ever since I started folding my bread using this technique, I've never had those holes. Issue number 2 that I see people have is, help, my bread is too dense. What happened? There are a few things with this one. Now this one can actually tie into your bread rising problems that you have, and we'll get to your bread not rising later on. But first and foremost, you want to make sure that you did not add too much flour when you were kneading your bread. Now, if you were doing this by machine, again, go back and watch my video. But if you're doing this by machine and you want to add the flour in just to where it starts pulling off the sides of the pan, it's still going to be sticky. It's not going to be workable at that time. And then you knead it very well. Again, I knead my breads for about 9 minutes in a Bosch universal mixer. If you are kneading by hand, you're going to need about a good 15 to 20 minutes to really activate that gluten into a nice, stretchy, soft dough. If your dough is already feeling heavy and dense, and it's not supposed to. Again, we're just talking about regular loaf breads here. That's when you already know right off the bat that you're gonna have a problem. If the dough in and of itself is just too heavy, you're gonna have problems rising. So my tips for not adding too much flour, again, by machine, make sure you're adding in the flour just enough where it starts to pull back away from the bowl as it is kneading, and then you leave it. It's gonna get better as it kneads. If you are kneading by hand, you are naturally going to use a little bit more flour than by machine, but in order to keep from doing too much, I suggest first actually wetting your hands just with water, just slightly wet them, and then work your dough. Also, if you are putting some flour on the counter, don't add a lot, just a little bit, so you're not incorporating too much flour in. And another thing is, if you're kneading by hand, to use a scraper. Again, I had this in one of my other videos. I had like a metal scraper that I got at the Dollar Tree that works great to help scrape the dough off of my counter or whatever it is that I'm kneading it, so that way I'm not needing to add, it's not sticking to my hands, I'm not needing to add more flour into it in order to keep kneading it. So I hope that makes sense. So just ways to where if you got to knead it by hand, that you can knead it where it's not sticking to your hands, but you're not necessarily needing to add more flour. As you knead it, it's going to get less sticky. So again, don't add too much flour. Another reason it might be too dense kind of ties into why it didn't rise. You didn't knead it enough. Again, by machine, you need about 9 minutes for my loaves, or 15 to 20 minutes by hand. You really need to make sure that you're kneading your bread well, that is activating that gluten in the bread that's going to help it to get more stretchy and to be able to rise well. Lastly, if your bread is too dense, check the wheat that you're using just to make sure. Again, for your large loaf breads, you want to use a hard red or hard white wheat. That has the higher protein content that's really going to help your bread to rise. And again, it being too dense ties into not rising. If it doesn't rise well, it's going to be a denser bread. Which leads us to problem number 3, your bread isn't rising well. This is probably the most common I have seen. I know I really struggled with it as well, as my bread just not rising. And there's a lot that can go on with this one. So let's tackle each one. First of all, big one, check your yeast. This is why I actually proof my yeast in my recipe. It's not just because I want to see all the little bubbles. Proofing your yeast, again, in my video where I show I have the yeast combined with a little bit of the flour and some water. We combine it all and then it sits there. And then I check about 15 to 20 minutes later, and I'm gonna see that it actually has already risen a little bit and it's a bit bubbly. That means you have good yeast and it's gonna help your bread. If when you proof it, you are not seeing bubbles, it is not really risen at all, you probably got some bad yeast. You need to toss it and try with some new stuff. Another reason that your bread possibly did not rise, once again, I'm beating a dead horse. You need to make sure you knead your bread well. This affects the density, it affects it rising. If you haven't kneaded it well enough, it has not activated that gluten well enough, therefore not being able to stretch and rise well. Third reason that your bread may not have risen well is your house may be too cold. I'm in Florida. I really never have this issue. But for those of you who live in a colder climate, or you're baking in winter, if it's really cold in your house, that's really going to slow down your bread rising. So a few things to do with that is, I even do this myself, where I shape my breads, put them in my loaf pans, I put them on top of my oven. Go ahead and turn my oven on, because if you see my video, I can rise my bread in about 20 minutes and it's ready to bake. So I just put mine on my oven. I cover it with one of those baby receiving blankets because it's not too dense. And by the time my oven has preheated, those loaves have risen very well, and I go ahead and put it in. The oven helps to keep that bread warm. Again, I'm in Florida. I rarely have to deal with the cold, but that's another thing that you can do. Another thing is, people sometimes put it in the oven with the pilot light on, or the light of the oven on. If you have propane or gas oven, I would not do this with your pilot light, because I do believe it gets too hot for that. You're going to start baking your bread, not just keeping it in a warm environment for rising. All right, reason number 4 that your bread may not be rising well is you may just have a bad recipe. Sometimes you you don't have a good recipe. It's not calling for the right wheat. It's not calling for the right amount of yeast or liquid or anything like that. So check your recipe. Again, mine I will have linked down below. It is a free printable recipe for you, and also my video as well for my recipe and my technique, because it's not just the recipe, y'all. It is about the technique as well. That is very important. Again, helping your bread to rise. 5, again, I've already said this. What wheat are you using? When we are using freshly milled grains, we have all the wheat that we can choose from. You typically need a hard wheat, so your hard red or your hard white wheat for your yeast spreads. If you were using just spelt, einkorn, immer, any of those other type of wheats, soft white wheat, it is not going to rise as well as you need it to be for a nice loaf bread. You can combine with your hard wheats. But if you were using just spelt solely, it's not going to go well. You need a high protein, low moisture wheat in order to get a really good rise on that bread. If you're not sure what wheat to use and what it does, be sure to check out this video up here where I talk about the different types of wheats, my favorite combinations, and which one do best for your wonderful big yeast loaves. Number 6 reason why your bread is not rising: you may be using too big of a pan. Now, my loaves are big. My loaves are 2-pound loaves. So I need a pan, a 9x5 pan that is a good 3 or 4 inches tall in order for it to hold all of that bread. But if you are doing a smaller loaf, say a 1-pound loaf, and you're using a huge bread pan, it may not look like it's rising too well because it's going out instead of up. So again, you want to make sure that you're using the right size pan for the amount of dough that you are using. And lastly, your bread not rising well is, did you shape it well? Again, all these reasons are generally tied together. So again, shaping that bread, folding it in a way where then you put it in your loaf pans to rise, that does matter. You don't want to just take your bread dough and dump it in a pan, because it's not going to look that pretty, and it may hinder the rising as well. On to problem number 4, the last one of common problems that I see people have with their bread. And this one is, it just falls. Your bread falls. And it's so devastating when you see it and you're like, oh, it's going to be beautiful. And then it falls. Like, oh, so frustrating. And there are things to go with this as well. So first and foremost, you need to make sure that you didn't rise it too much before putting it in the oven. Your bread will rise even more in the oven while baking. This is called oven spring. So when you hear that term, hey, it has a nice oven spring, that's what it's referring to. When you place that bread into the oven and it rises even more. So again, with my breads, I rise them until maybe they're about an inch above the pan. Then I put them in a preheated oven, and it's gonna rise another good 2 to 3 inches while in that oven. And if you rise your bread too much, that's why it falls. It just rose too much. So be sure you're not rising it too much before you actually bake it. And always make sure that you're putting it into a preheated oven before you bake it as well. Another reason why your bread might fall is it actually might look good when it comes out of the oven, but fall after you have it out of the oven and it cools. So sometimes why this happens is, one, you actually have holes in that bread, which causes it, as it's cooling, to fall a little bit. Another reason it might fall after it's already baked is you sliced it open before it was cooled down. I know it is so tempting to slice open that bread when it's right out of the oven and you just slather on some butter and it's just, it's good. It's good. I get it. And sometimes I do it, but I at least know that it's gonna cause my bread to fall. It will make it fall a little bit if you slice it while it's still hot. So make sure, if you don't want it to fall and you still want it to look good, to make sure that you wait until it's completely cooled before slicing into it. A bonus tip for why your bread might be falling, and this might be something you've never thought about, make sure that while your bread is rising, while your bread is baking, that you don't have any elephants running through this house. I know you probably literally don't have elephants running through the house, but if you have kids, it is possible. It sounds like elephants running through the house But bottom line is you do not want to be running around or jumping up and down right next to your bread, because that vibration, that movement can actually cause your bread to fall. Also, be very careful when you put your bread into the oven or when you're moving it before it's baked, because the slightest bump can cause that bread to fall. I know, because I've done it and it was really sad. I was very sad. It was still good, but I bumped it just a little bit while I was trying to put it into my oven, and I already started to see it fall, and it was really sad, and I was really sad. So be careful handling that bread. Keep your kids from running through the house, especially if you have subfloors, and that will help to limit that bit of vibration that can cause your bread to fall as well. So that is it. I hope that was very helpful for you. To recap, the biggest issues people have with their bread is it's just too dense, you have holes in the bread didn't rise very well, or it falls before or after it bakes. The biggest problems. So to make sure that you can go ahead and circumvent these issues, make sure that you have good yeast starting off with. Proof that yeast first, just to make sure that it's good. And this works even with a sourdough starter. You can proof that sourdough starter to make sure it's going to be good as well. Also, make sure that you have a good recipe and technique for the type of bread that you are trying to bake. And last but not least, use the right wheat. This is a big one, and I think probably one of the most common is just using the right wheat. Again, for tall, wonderful yeast loaves, you want those hard wheats. You can mix it in with an ancient grain or a soft wheat, things like that. But ultimately, you need that high protein, low moisture bread that's going to help your bread to rise. And above all, knead it well. Knead. Your bread needs to be kneaded. Your bread needs to be kneaded. I made a little pun there. I'm hilarious. Okay, so make sure you're kneading very well. I know it can be time consuming, especially if you're kneading it by hand, but it is important, and you build strong muscles while you're at it. But for those of us with machines, make sure you're kneading it well in those machines. 9 minutes roughly for my loaves. Basically, you just need to knead it well until that dough is soft. When you push down on it, it springs back a bit. You can stretch it a bit without it breaking, and that's how you know you're going to have a good loaf. Fold it well and bake that bread. All right, so that's it. I hope these tips were very helpful for you. Be sure to check out the description box below for my recipe, my technique, my video that I mentioned as well. And also be sure to sign up for our newsletter. I come out with a newsletter every single week. You get tips and tricks behind the scenes. You also get to be notified of things before everyone else. So be sure to click that link below to sign up. Also hit this like video, subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.